Thank you, everybody. I've never been to St. Petersburg, so it's really great to be here and to see this cool town. It's really nice. I live in Ireland where things are kind of small, so it's kind of cool to see giant hotels. So I'm going to be talking about the development of 1996's Quake 1. This is Postmortem. So Quake was released in 1996, but the story of Quake starts in 1990. So we used to play Dungeons and Dragons, and in John Carmack's campaign was a group called the Silver Shadow Band that did work for a group called Justice. In the Silver Shadow Band was this badass named Quake that had an incredible Thor-like hammer. He's someone you would almost never see because he was so high level, and our group was just made up of low-level peons. We're basically lucky to see him at any time and go on an awesome adventure with him once or twice. Needless to say, we wanted to make a game with Quake in it, especially if we could play as Quake. And we were finishing up our first Commander Keen trilogy, and we decided that we wanted to make Quake next. So in the preview section of Marooned on Mars, the very first Commander Keen game made in 1990, we hyped up the idea for our next game, Quake: The Fight for Justice. So we worked on the prototype for a couple weeks in January of 1991, and it just wasn't what we were thinking. The technology was not there yet. So we decided to put it on ice. So someday we will make Quake. It reminds me of the start of Pixar. If any of you know the story about Pixar, all the ideas for all of their movies came out of one meeting at the start of the company, all the way up to the movie WALL-E. So we continued working. We made a game called Dangerous Dave in the Haunted Mansion. Anyone played this game before? Yeah, all right. 1991. We decided we're going to return to Quake later. It wasn't time. So we released Wolfenstein 3D, 1992. And then we released this game called Spear of Destiny. Has anyone played Spear of Destiny? Yeah, I didn't think that many. It was kind of a sequel that was not really heavily promoted. Doom, I think some people played that. All right. So we made Doom right after that, 1993. Then we made Doom 2. Probably played Doom 2 if you like Doom 1. Yeah? All right. And while Doom 2 was happening, we were also making a game called Heretic with a company called Raven. People play Heretic? Yeah, all right. And of course, Hexen after Heretic. Yeah, that's personally one of my favorite games here. Of course. So John Carmack, he was planning on making his next engine a true 3D engine, thank God. We decided that it was time for Quake. It was only 4 years after we had made the prototype, but in that time, we had made 15 games. We made an engine upgrade to Wolfenstein 3D for Raven Software's Shadowcaster. We messed around with the Atari Lynx while we were in development for Wolf 3D for Atari. And Atari even wanted us to create their mascot character, which we named Pounce, but Atari dissolved after that. And we made the Super Nintendo version of Wolfenstein 3D. And so we had this really, team with only 6 people in it at the time. Archvile is standing in for Tom Hall back there. So the original ideas behind Quake were starting to develop, at the end of 1994, and we didn't have a cohesive vision of how the game, or really how the game would play. We kind of kept it open. So we did not immediately assume that it would be a shooter. What we had was the knowledge that we would be creating a true 3D world for gameplay to take place in. Our game design ideas began with Quake the character. He had a huge and powerful hammer. He could throw that hammer and destroy buildings, at least in the D&D universe. Quake came from a medieval time period, so we already knew that the game would take place in the past. We talked about maybe, how the camera could move around. Like one incredible scene that we wanted to make possible is that you would sneak up behind someone in multiplayer mode, and maybe someone standing at the edge of a hill, and you slam their head in with a hammer right in the back of their skull, and they tumble down the mountain forwards, and the world rotates forwards, as opposed to just left and right rotation that people had been used to forever. Well, we never got that working, but the idea was there just in case we decided to have that kind of gameplay. Well, the first part of starting work on the engine was establishing what our priorities were going to be. So client-server architecture was just as important as the engine being truly 3D. We're not going to be faking it like our Doom era tech. This time it was going to be real, and it had to be really fast. To do that, we're going to be using the FPU, the floating point unit, for the first time to speed up 3D calculations, since most processors at that time had them built in. And we were developing on Intel Pentium chips, around 90 megahertz with 8 megs of RAM. We were still targeting DOS as the gaming operating system to play it on. And we were developing the game on Next Step workstations. So before making levels, we needed a level editor that could create 3D maps. And before we could write a 3D level editor, we needed to define the structure of the world and how it would be represented. So this was John Carmack's new engine design, and it was going to be based on what he called brushes. So a brush could be any shape, but in the editor, it would start as a rectangular volume. And special cutting tools could shave off edges so the slopes could be made, but those tools cut at an infinite distance. So creating interesting shapes required several brushes individually sliced and pieced together. An example of this is the first door you see when you come down the ramp from the initial slipgate. It's a high-tech door that has a notch on one side, and the other side has a bump on it, and they fit perfectly together. And to create this door required 3 pieces on one side and 2 pieces on the other side. The editor was called Quake Ed, and it had a pretty unique way of making levels, because creating a true 3D editor would be like creating today's Maya or 3D Studio Max from scratch, and that would take a really long time. So we went with a really simplistic editor that showed levels just from the top down, and a side view that showed the brushes that were under a special marker that we placed whenever we wanted to adjust the vertical height of the brushes. We could drag the brushes in the view up and down and see the results in a small 3D rendered view. You can tell how painful this was. Because of this way of viewing and creating levels, it took more work to make simple things like a ramp, like the ramp that you walk down when you come through the slipgate. You may be thinking that this way of editing levels would be incredibly difficult and insane, and you'd be right. For example, for that base door, I had to draw the door in 2D in the editor, then rotate it so that it was vertical. And then I could rotate it and move it into place using the side view and the marker. This process happened for every single brush in every single level. It was extremely labor intensive. But the team was making levels instead of waiting for this huge 3D tool to be created. So here's some sketches that I made before starting on the very first Quake map, which was E1M1. The final map basically had that shape, the golden horseshoe. At this time, it was early 1995, and a lot was happening at the time. Doom and Doom 2 were out in the world, and they had really changed gaming. Dealing with that involved an incredible amount of talking to journalists because everyone wanted to know how he did it and who we were. And it was really important to keep John Carmack coding and away from press interviews. So Jay Wilbur, our CEO, and I basically handled those duties. So John Carmack knew that he was going to need some more programming firepower. At this bleeding edge of technology, we could only work with the best. The first obvious person who entered our minds was Michael Abrash. After all, he was the genius that wrote Power Graphics Programming, which was the book that John Carmack learned from that gave him all the graphics knowledge that he needed to develop the very first Commander Keen engine in 1990, the game that helped make the PC into a real gaming platform. And Michael was a programming legend already back then. He had written for Dr. Dobbs' journal for years, teaching the intricacies of 8086 assembly language the way that Roger Wagner taught 6502 assembly in the pages of Soft Talk magazine 10 years earlier. Michael was a hero programmer, and John needed a hero who could write assembly language fast and great. So John flew up to Seattle, where Michael was working at Microsoft. He flew up there to convince Michael that Quake's technology would be the first steps towards the metaverse that Neil Stephenson describes in his book Snow Crash. This was something that Michael was very interested in doing. Well, it didn't take much more pushing from John to get Michael to leave Microsoft and move to Texas. So the first half of 1995 was very busy with bringing Abrash into id Software, my coding of Quake Ed to get Sandy Peterson and American McGee learning how to make levels in 3D, getting Hexen underway with Raven Software, working on the Ultimate Doom, which is the first retail version of Doom that people could actually walk into a store and buy, and me spending time experimenting with true 3D level creation in Quake Ed. So there was a lot going on at that time. During the first 4 months, the engine was working with a client-server architecture, and we made some test levels so we could move around in them in multiplayer. Since we hadn't established how we were going to be building models yet, we used a Golden Sphere 2D sprite. After a short time of researching methods of making 3D models with animation and hardware that could do it quickly and easily, John decided on a path to reading in 3D file formats and UV mapping skin textures. We bought a Silicon Graphics Indigo workstation and alias modeling software. Kevin Cloud decided that he was going to be the guy making all of Quake's 3D models. Adrian would do the textures and everything else that was 2D. Kevin made the player model first so we could stop moving around as spheres. The skin textures were a little tricky because they were limited in total coverage, so Kevin had to model in a certain way. American was very busy making a ton of very small maps for John's engine to render. The engine was going through a lot of changes, mainly architectural in the renderer for the sake of speed. American made probably about 50 small maps for John, stressing different areas of the renderer. And those were all throwaway maps, at the same time that he was working on actual levels for the game. So rewritten algorithms for caching light map rendered textures meant Abrash had to rewrite his tightly written assembly language loops over and over. By the end of the engine's development, there were 8 major engine render architecture changes that required rewriting. Let me also just take the time to say that Quake's renderer was written before the existence of GPUs. That means that every single pixel on the screen was computed with perspective correct texture mapping and placed on the VGA screen, which had a limit of only 256 colors. The screen was at a ratio of 4:3 because no one had 16:9 monitors, since there were no video resolutions that supported that. Quake was usually run in 320x200 pixel mode. This is an early screenshot of Quake before we created the status bar. Halfway through 1995, we still did not have a solid game designed because the engine kept going through changes, and we had no additional coders who could write gameplay code to test our early ideas. So, work kept going on models and textures and levels and technology. We knew that whatever we created would be usable in any design idea that we settled on. Hexen launched on October 30th, which was called Devil's Night, during this huge Dwango Deathmatch 1995 event held at Microsoft's campus. Does anyone remember Dwango? Yeah? I think there was a Russian server or two. I was at the office to play Deathmatch that night over the modem with the winner of the Doom 95 tournament that took place. The winner was Dennis Fong, also known as Thresh. The twist was that we had the deathmatch in Hexen, which I'd been playing a lot of, in which he played for the first time that night. So work continued for another few weeks until the engine was finally considered done enough to make the game. Now we would have programmer time dedicated to gameplay programming. We decided to have a company-wide meeting to determine which direction we would go in. At that time, the team was burnt out. We'd been working away for a year trying to make a game without gameplay programming or an idea of how fast the engine could go. The speed of the engine helps determine the kind of game that we could make. A slower engine would be able to create the game design that we had at the start of the project, and a very fast engine would be used for an FPS. I wanted to experiment with the game design and see what we could do with this new full 3D fast engine, and I was not as interested in making another FPS as I was about exploring our possibility space. Half the team, made up of the members who were burnt out, wanted to just slap some FPS guns in it and finish the levels and ship it. The other half were okay with trying to do some design experimentation. At that point, if you're working with a team in that state, the only way forward is to do the easiest thing. So we decided we were going to make Quake an FPS. We'd start working in a common room, and we would get the game done as fast as possible. At that point, I decided that my time at id would be done after shipping Quake. We'd just taken over the rest of the 6th floor at Town East Tower. The offices that we just got were demolished, and just basically all the walls, every single thing was demolished so we could rebuild it. So we picked this huge corner space as our war room, we called it. This area is where we would finish Quake in this big room. We all moved our computers in there and everything else. So around this time, we found out that Nine Inch Nails were big fans of Doom, and they played it on their tour bus after their shows. So we got in touch with Trent Reznor, and we talked about him doing the soundtrack for Quake. So he came to our office, we talked about it, we decided that the music would be ambient, not really songs like our previous games had. In the meantime, Trent got us some ambient music that a friend of his made to kind of hold us over while we were waiting for him to finish the Quake soundtrack. My first task was to redesign the game so it used all the currently created levels, add some interesting story to it, and some creature design that emphasized the Lovecraftian influence of our environment and the story. So I added several enslaved old ones, various keys in different dimensions that you needed to travel to so you could free them, and a little bit more complexity. And after talking with Kevin and Adrian about how many models, animations, and textures they could do, I had to simplify the design into a game that we could finish pretty quickly. So I took a lot of those keys and characters out, and I streamlined the design back to a really simple get a key, open the door, kill monsters, find secrets, find the exit stuff that we really know well. So the newest stuff was inherent in the engine technology, such as the way secret doors open by moving back and then sliding sideways. Doors can move horizontally now. And we finally had platforms that could follow a path and take the player on a ride. We had water you could swim in, and you heard the surface of the water and the wind blowing outside. We added wind tunnels that could propel the player through the air, and we could even change gravity and let the player float. So we used the special properties of the engine to make the levels more dynamic than Doom. And it resulted in a very scary single-player campaign mode. So this was January of 1996, and the mood in the war room was not a good one. People didn't talk to each other much, and the atmosphere was pretty oppressive. The room was mostly silent, where in years past we'd be sharing music played on a boombox. We just had to get the game done, so we entered crunch mode. This was 7 days a week until we shipped. So I called Tom Hall, my id co-founder from before, who left halfway through Doom, if he'd be interested in co-founding a new company after I shipped Quake. Tom was working on his latest game at the time that was called Prey, and said that he would love to start another company. So the plans for Ion Storm lay dormant until after Quake's release. Around the end of February, we got the game ready to test multiplayer mode with a few deathmatch maps. In fact, we decided that we wanted all players to test the game for us. We called it Q-Test, and it took us 38 hours nonstop to get it ready. And we uploaded it to an FTP site on February 24th of 1996 and just watched the internet reaction. Did anyone play Q-Test here? It was a long time ago. I can understand if you weren't around. A couple days later, we called 7 of the most hardcore local Doomers over to our office so we could watch them play the game. They loved it, and their feedback helped us refine some movement and level issues. The time after Q-Test was a blur. We were working away every single day. We got an offer to sell id Software to our publisher, GT Interactive, for $100 million at that time. We were so deep in Quake that we said that we could not even think about it right now. We just were not in the correct frame of mind. So on we continued crunching, making more levels, making more monsters, more sounds, checking off the design checkboxes. To keep the game at a reasonable size, we had to impose a limitation. We decided that a level's BSP size could not be bigger than 1.4 megabytes. With this restriction, we couldn't make really huge, long, plain levels. I remember working on a really cool entrance for E2M6, and after the level was built, and it went over 1.4 megabytes. So I just deleted the entire entrance and left it as it was originally designed. It was just no use arguing at that point. We all just wanted to get the game done. So eventually, I did release the bigger version of the level onto the internet about 10 years afterwards. We were getting close to finishing the levels, and everyone on the team could feel that the game's end was near. The crunch was so intense that American McGee was sick for the entire last month of the game's development. We did not see him until a couple weeks after the game came out. Other team members pitched in to finish the levels so we could ship. I finished doing the sound work. We finally got the tracks from 9 Inch Nails, and a horrible decision from their record company. The music could not be in MP3 format. So the music had to be CD audio tracks burned onto a physical CD, playable only on CD. And this is the reason why none of the music played while people played the game. They would have had to leave the CD in the CD player all the time. So on the day of release, I don't even remember how we decided the day that Quake was ready to go, but it was a Saturday, June 22nd in 1996. And as I had done for every single id Software game since the beginning, I created the demos that you see in the Attract mode, and I created the Gold Masters. Nobody was at the office. The company was totally broken. It took me several hours to get the game in a final state because it was the first game that we made that had subdirectories. And finding a compression that was not zip and handled subdirectories was difficult. in 1996. I settled on the LHA compressor, which you probably have never heard of. And it took a while to finally get it to work. I wanted someone else at the office to be there for the upload of Quake to the internet. So I called my friend Mark Fletcher, who is a really hardcore doomer. And I was on IRC, making sure everyone knew that the upload was imminent. IRC was exploding and the channel was splitting constantly due to too many people being on it. I uploaded quake.zip and hung out to hear the fans' reactions, and then Mark and I left. The next month was a pretty slow one. People were recuperating. American finally came back to the office. I took a 2-week vacation, came back, and I created the retail gold masters for physical distribution. Right after that, on August 6th, John Carmack wanted me out of the company, and I wanted to start Ion Storm with Tom Hall, so everything worked out. Within 6 months after leaving, half of id Software's 13 employees left the company. Quake had taken its toll. But of course, that was not the end. id Software went on to create the incredible Quake 2 right after that. People play Quake 2 here? Yeah. Awesome game. And I was busy heading up Ion Storm while we worked on 4 games at one time. We worked on Anachronox, Dominion, Daikatana, and Deus Ex. A lot of Ds. We all still continue to create games to this day, with the exception of John. He's dedicated to VR, and Abrash is there to help him. Kevin is still at id Software. He's been with the company since 1992. Tom is at Play First in San Francisco, and I'm at Romero Games in Galway, Ireland, where life is good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
So now we are going to have some short 15 minutes Q&A session. And during this Q&A session, please ask questions. Can I switch to Russian?
Okay.
Давайте задавать вопросы сейчас по поводу доклада. У нас есть 15 минут на такие вопросы. Все вопросы, которые связаны со всеми остальными темами, и вы просто хотите задать эти вопросы Джону, можно будет задать во время Q&A-сессии, которая продлится час в холле в атриуме экспофорума, куда мы с Джоном пройдем сразу после завершения доклада. Давайте, у кого есть вопросы по поводу доклада? So, если вы боитесь задавать вопрос по-английски, я могу его вам перевести, вы можете его задать по-русски.
Okay, thank you, John. It was awesome presentation. However, its title, I think, was not really explained. I was expecting to hear a postmortem because obviously Quake is dead. Everyone is playing Dota, CSGO, whatever. Can you tell exactly what had happened to the Arena FPS and Quake? Why the game had died? And no one ever, except very hardcore fans among us, still plays it. Thank you.
Well, it's kind of funny because Arena Deathmatch, I think, kind of started with Quake 3. Even though you could play Doom and Quake with a lot of people together, it took a little while for Arena to kind of catch fire. And in 1999, when Quake 3 was released, and then Team Arena right after that, there were a lot of really cool mods that took advantage of the Arena format, like Rocket Arena 3. And
Вот прям выходишь.
and I personally am not a fan of Arena because I like one-on-one matches. Because I feel like I earn every frag versus getting slammed in the back by someone I don't even know is there. For me, if I play Arena Deathmatch, it's just for target practice and not really for score. It's like a warm-up for the real match, which is a one-on-one with somebody. Maybe that's why it didn't work out. When you play, deathmatch in other games, arena isn't like the really big thing. I think maybe, I guess, Battle Royale's kind of an arena, but it's such a gigantic arena. Maybe just the arena format moved to something else like Battle Royale, where you actually feel like you're getting some time to play versus a smaller level where you just get killed right after you spawn, Counter-Strike style.
Следующий вопрос.
No.
Так,
John, you mentioned that the idea for Quake came from a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that John Romero ran. What was the setting it took place in? Like Greyhawk or Faerun, or was it a Homebrew setting that he came up with?
What was that? What was the
What was the setting that the
oh, the
campaign-
setting for
Ah,
the original D&D campaign?
right.
Or in Quake?
Yes.
Both? Well, the D&D campaign was absolutely medieval. It was a totally like classic Dungeons and Dragons medieval time period. It was the D&D setting was not the typical one because John had been running his world for years before we actually met and started playing in it. And he had a really huge map that not everybody got to see because you just have to, you have to get high enough level to even deal with the crazy stuff that he has at the outer edges of the map. So what normally happens when you play D&D, when you play a session of D&D is that there's a focus on a specific module that is a specific location and everything's designed around that location. And with John, he had a world that was just massive and you could go anywhere at any time. Except for, you could die. If you go into areas that are just too difficult, you could totally just die, and that's a consequence of, that you kind of make your decision to do that. But it was a very political world. So it wasn't just about hacking and slashing stuff constantly. It was about who runs what areas, can we get on their good side, can we do something for them? And while we're doing that, we're running into all these weird mysteries because we'd find like crystal coffins in the forest that are, what is that? He would just throw all kinds of crazy stuff everywhere. And we are investigating it and end up on crazy adventures, lots of different dimensions and lots of magic. And it was really, really cool. It was really neat to have a kind of a boundless D&D campaign where you could just decide, we're going to go that way, and he could totally handle it.
how did you come up with Quake after this game, by the way? Actually.
How did he come up with Quake?
You say like the idea of Quake came from playing this game,
Yeah,
and
because-
now it seems totally different.
Yeah,
How did you come up
it
with-
was originally the original idea of Quake. That was the medieval design that we kind of
Okay.
had. When it turned into an FPS, it didn't make sense because you're not going to use a hammer and all that. But we really loved the name Quake.
Oh, yeah.
So what we decided to do was just name Quake is the character that you never see that is controlling all of the different dimensions, and you're kind of going after them as they are shipping things through the slipgate and trying to take over different dimensions. It was a pretty weak story.
Okay.
Hello, John. What do you think was the main reason Daikatana failed?
The main reason for
Daikatana failed.
Oh, wow. It wasn't that good. One of the things I think a lot of people don't know about Daikatana is that when I put together Ion Storm, I didn't appreciate the fact that the people that I was working with at id Software had so much experience. By the time we got together, to make our first game at id, each of us had been making games for 10 years already. So when I started Ion Storm, I didn't hire a whole bunch of veterans. I decided that the people who are modders that really are passionate about making levels and making Quake bots and stuff like that would be pretty cool to have on a dev team. So I basically built a dev team out of modders. And many of these modders had never had a job before. They'd never been in the industry, and none of them had ever made a game. So I was the only person on the team to have ever made a game before. And at that time, I'd made 90-some games, and none of them had made a single game. So it was a very long process to get these people over 3 years to release something that a major publisher would actually put out. And there are people who are nuts about Daikatana and love it. It's been over the past 10 years, it's been upgraded to a decent game with 1.3 patch that dev teams have kind of took over the source code and just fixed everything. So, it might be an average game now.
Hey, John. First thing first, I'd like to thank you for attending our Doom party last year. We appreciate it.
Right.
Thank you. And I have a question about Quake. So in Quake, it's inspired by Lovecraftian mythos. So you go through all the different dimensions, gathering the Eldritch rooms. But we have one great final boss in the first episode, the Catan. And then when you complete the second one, the third one, the fourth one, there are no bosses. Just grab a room, go back to the exit. Were the bosses for the remaining episodes actually planned? Did you have to cut them out because of time constraints or something like that? What exactly did you have in mind, if you did?
Yeah, so we did not have time to make new models for those final levels and then program them and do all that. So instead, we decided to do something that we'd done before in Doom, which is take a powerful creature and then make that the boss at the end of an episode, and then you see them in the next episode, the way that the Barons of Hell were at the end of episode 1 in Doom, and then they were kind of all over the rest of Doom. So the Shalrath, I think, was the name of the character that was in the second episode, and you saw it for the first time at the very end, and so it was like this weird thing. In like the last boss was in the final level called End, and that was the only other character that we created that needed to be its own model. We couldn't just take something that we had done before because it was like the end of the game. We need to do something. So it basically just sat there. We weren't going to do other stuff with it, so I had to come up with the idea of telefragging it. All right.
Hey, John. I'm here. I have two small questions. First, Doom is awesome.
Doom?
Doom is awesome.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And my second question, Quake have some unfound Easter eggs yet or not?
Say that again. Do I have some?
Have a Quake some unfound Easter eggs or not? Easter eggs.
Oh, Easter eggs in Quake?
Are there any Easter eggs which have never been found yet in Quake?
No. People have pulled those levels apart so many times. Yeah, there isn't anything I don't think that people have not found in Quake.
Hello, Jen.
Hi.
What would be the top 5 games that you would recommend to play? Maybe modern ones, maybe like not yours, of course, but like the modern ones, probably. Thanks.
Top 5 games. Well, I love Minecraft. We actually do. We play Minecraft because we have 4 kids, and our kids love Minecraft. And for a family game, it's a nice game because it's not it doesn't need to be intense all the time. Like we love playing Overcooked, but that's a crazy intense thing. We don't have a family that wants to kill each other in deathmatch all the time, so we play Minecraft just because it's chilled out and people can kind of join each other and help build things or mine things or go exploring or whatever. So it's actually been a family game of ours for about 8 years now. So that's one game. I played Drop 7, whenever I'm on trips usually. Drop 7 is a very casual game that's kind of a mathematical game made a while ago by a a designer that he's really, really great. His name's, God, I can't remember his last name, Frank. Anyway, he's, what? Frank Lance, yeah, of Area Code. He teaches at NYU in New York. Really great game. My wife and I compete in it all the time, and she just sent me a screenshot 2 days ago of the high score that she just got for this year. There's always a yearly high score. It's not like a game that I would say, yeah, that's like the coolest game ever, but it's a really nice, like, we just have a competition going for years. I love Hitman. I love the new Hitman games, 1 and 2. I think the design of the new Hitman design is just incredible. And I love playing it and replaying it over and over again. Shooter-wise, geez, I really like the original Ghost Recon a lot. Has anyone played the original PC version of Ghost Recon? Desert Siege and Island Thunder and all that stuff. They're amazing. It's amazingly replayable. And that's definitely one of my top games of all time, just because of how replayable that shooter is compared to other shooters. World of Warcraft. I love WoW. I've been playing WoW since it came out. In fact, one of the programmers on Quake, his name is John Cash, and he was the network programmer on Quake. He was the lead programmer of World of Warcraft, so when he left he went over to Blizzard and became the lead programmer on WoW. So he was there making that game for 5 years, and I think he's still at Blizzard now. Yeah.
You should actually recommend Empire of Sin, I guess.
Yeah, Empire of Sin is our new game. Have you guys heard of it?
Who heard about it? The new game John does.
Yeah, it's a 1920s Prohibition-era Chicago turn-based strategy game. It's real-time until you get into combat. And if you do, just check out some reviews. And if you YouTube the trailer, there's an interview with my wife, Brenda, who's the game designer on it. And I'm there, and I work on the game as well. It's a really, really good game. And the previews, because we're pre-beta still, and the previews are really good. So we're happy. We got PC Gamer and everybody to play it for hours in our booth, and they liked it. So it's not something that you would expect, but Brenda loves Civilization. You know, it's one of her favorite games, and she wanted to make something in that time period that was kind of like it. So it's pretty cool. Empire of Sin.
Well, we have 1 minute. One last question.
Right there?
I see there. Anyone? Okay. The one is.
Я буду говорить по-русски, попрошу перевести. Читая книгу «Мастера судьбы», мастера Doom, в конце как бы было сказано, что вы занялись разработкой игр для мобильных платформ, и сегмент мобильного гейминга, в особенности приложений сейчас для смартфонов, он растет. Что вы как бы об этом думаете, и собирается ли Romero Games делать игры для мобильных платформ, или вы останетесь верны ПК-платформе?
So the question is, if you read a Masters of Doom book, somewhere in the end, it's said that mobile platforms grow, and the question is, are you going to go to mobile platform to make some platform mobile games, or you're going to stick to the desktop and PC platform?
I've been desktop like since I started. So PC all the way. I actually did mobile games in 2001. I started making mobile games. And at that time, I made a pretty funny game called Hyperspace Delivery Boy. Has anyone heard of that game? It's pretty rare. All right, well, we're planning on bringing it back, actually, to just kind of remaster it. And then in 2017, we released a game called Gunman Taco Truck, which is a funny game. It's basically all my humor. I wrote every line of dialogue and text and stuff in it. And it was actually, we just put it out there with no advertising or anything, because it's on mobile, it's on iOS and Android. it's hard to get anybody to like be able to see your game. Apple told me that every month 20,000 games are put on the iOS store every single month. So it's hard to see like games unless you have a lot of marketing and money. So we just kind of put it out there, and we, unbelievably, Apple chose the game as one of the games that they loved. We never talked to Apple, they just chose it out of the huge ocean of games that's constantly being put out there. And then we put it on the Mac, and they chose it for the Mac. And then they did a review, an interview with our son Donovan, who designed the game. And so they did when they redid the App Store to include developer stories and other stories, they wanted him in there. So they did an interview with Donovan over the phone. And then about a year later, when the iPhone 10 came out, they actually contacted me and asked if I would upgrade Gunman Taco Truck to the iPhone 10, just out of the blue. So it's a neat game. I think it's pretty fun. It's cool. It's hard, very difficult game. But it's hilarious at the same time. Right now, I'm not focusing on mobile stuff. We're focusing on basically everything else. We're desktop and the consoles, PS4 and Xbox, and Empire of Sin is also on the Switch. And I just came from Gamescom, from yesterday, Gamescom, and I've been busy, just checking out what's out there and getting the press to pay attention to Empire of Sin. And so it's turning out really cool. We're pretty happy.
Thank you, John.
All right, thanks.